Dear guests, the program is about to start. Please find your seats now.
Interesting sessions at the beginning, so I'm glad to have you all here. We're going to have an interesting discussion this afternoon. But before, because we don't have a lot of time and there's a lot of information coming out from my panelists, I'd love to invite the Minister, Mr. Marcus Schachner. I hope I don't murder your name. Welcome.
Thank you. I used to have speeches, and they are long. But I'm really happy to be here and welcome you all. Media freedom is a very important topic globally, of course. And I'm very happy as a Foreign Minister of Estonia that Estonia is now the co-chair of Media Freedom Coalition together with Netherlands. And this is very important for us as well. As you know, our history that we haven't had this freedom and also media freedom. And even I remember the times when we had to think what we are talking about and actually not believing anything what we were talked about, everything. But I think that within the last 32 years we have achieved a lot. Now we belong to the leader countries of any kind of freedoms and media freedom as well. And it gives us as well the ground to talk about these topics globally. What I want to say is that I'm not going to repeat here in this crowd how important it is that we have media freedom. We must protect our journalists globally. And as well that more than 80% of our people globally are not living in conditions that they should, and they have an opportunity about the freedom of media or as well to talk and the reach on the free media information. And this is something what is concerning us as well. I believe in that people have the common understanding and values to make right decisions. But the question is what kind of information they have and how much they can actually speak freely out their ideas. I'm just giving you a couple of examples. One is from Estonia. It's 2007. Actually, it was, if we compare today's world, it was a peacetime in the winning. But Estonia was under the great and heavy pressure from Russia about using our Russian-speaking minority issues here, and also the symbols of ex-Soviet Union and identification what Putin actually tried to give to Russian people in Russia. It was a great victory of the Second World War and also all the communistic party symbols. We had a statue in Estonia in the middle of Tallinn here. Nobody actually touched that because it was something from the past. It was a communistic Soviet monument. And we decided to remove it because Russia used this as an example to make some kind of conflict in a society. And they were very successful. And then we had the first mass rallies on the streets and police and everything. We can see this in Paris and somewhere else like every weekend. But for us, it was something very shocking. And also, there are lots of fake information and disinformation from Russia globally. And we were, in the first hours, under the great pressure globally, mainly from our partners, that what we are doing. Are we punishing the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia and so on? But because of the media freedom and also because of our partners and capability to share the real information, actually we won this conflict. And there, we got even more support from our partners and from the democratic world. But the second example is not maybe so, how to say, positive, but it has a positive impact. It's a Russian aggression against Ukraine. If you can remember, at the beginning of the war, there was many kind of rumors and what really will happen and what are the plans. And there was a understanding. I used to be as well a defense minister before that, you know, Ukraine is weak and probably they won't win. And it was something like old-fashioned knowledge about the leaderships of the different nations and countries. But actually, Ukraine win the war already, I think, within the first couple of weeks or the months. And we remember the tragedy and genocide in Bucha. Everybody knows globally what happened in Bucha. And I think this was the moment when globally, most people, they actually started to support Ukrainians and understood that this is not just a war or some kind of military conflict. It is not only about getting more power or aggression from Russia, but this is something more. It touched all the human beings globally. I think in Africa, in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, everywhere, these kind of stories, because we are humans. And there I'm coming out, my idea is that actually today's media and communication is not based only about what is true and what is wrong, what is true information, what is disinformation. But it is unfortunately based on conflicts. Only conflicts can reach to the people. Only headlines are getting our attentions more than long analysis. And only stories which are touching us personally are actually reaching to people's mind. And that's the reason why media freedom is crucial as well to make the leaderships of the different governments and countries to make their opinion. And I think that we reached actually on that level that we see European Union, we see US, we see globally different nations now supporting and understanding how serious actually the Russian aggression against Ukraine, how serious is actually this genocide, how serious is that more than 20,000 children has been deported today, 21st century, to Russia and for sale in the black market. This kind of information, this kind of news actually is changing as well the government's attitudes. And now we see as well the Grand Coalition globally standing for the values first time after the Second World War, really. So I'm finishing my keynote from that point that we have to work hard to protect journalists. We have to work hard to stand for media freedom globally because I believe in human being. I believe in humans because we're actually doing the right things, but we have to affect the leadership of different governments through the peoples because the communication today is personal, reaching us everywhere, social media, news, everywhere. And I wish us good panel today and the conference, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I just want to invite our colleague from UNESCO, Dr. Tawfik Jelassi. He'll give us a short speech before we start our panel. And then after Jelassi's speech, I'll invite our panelists to come to and we can start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the government of Estonia for their kind hospitality and for giving us the opportunity today and tomorrow to discuss such important issues which the Minister has eloquently introduced. Congratulations to Estonia to be the new co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition. UNESCO has been involved with the coalition for many years, and we have attended in February 2022 the meeting that you have kindly hosted here in Tallinn. I would like also to thank the Open Government Partnership for organizing this gathering today and making it possible with so many participants around. I'm honored to be here on behalf of the UNESCO Director General, Madame Audrey Azoulay, to contribute our voice to the debate and to share with you briefly what we are doing on this important topic of the session. UNESCO has been the UN specialized agency in charge of promoting and protecting freedom of expression, media development, and the safety of journalists. We have been at the forefront for a decade now in charge of implementing the United Nations Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists. We celebrated actually a year ago in Vienna through a ministerial conference. We celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity for crimes committed against journalists. We have worked very closely with the media sector, with journalists, with civil society organizations, with the Media Freedom Coalition to uphold the values that we all share. In this framework, we have implemented the Global Media Defense Fund. UNESCO has been in charge of implementing this important Global Media Defense Fund, which is co-founded by Estonia, but also 17 other donors. This fund is a very important financing mechanism to provide legal defense, legal protection to thousands of journalists worldwide. This was created back in July 2019. Over the last 3 years, this Global Media Defense Fund has supported over 5,000 journalists from over 100 countries, involving 1,500 lawyers and over 200 non-governmental organizations. So I think through these figures you can see the major impact that this Global Media Defense Fund has had on the ground. UNESCO has also been the designated custodian agency for reporting on Sustainable Development Goal 16.10.2. This goal very much focuses on ensuring citizens' access to information. We have been working with dozens of countries drafting, implementing national laws that guarantee unfettered citizens' access to information. And we annually monitor and report on the progress made by countries in providing guarantees to citizens for access, public access to information. In 2022, we saw a significant increase in the number of countries that have introduced constitutional, statutory, and policy guarantees for access to information. Let me share with you a statistic. Today, we have 137 countries that offer guarantees to their citizens for access to information. This figure was much, much lower a few years ago. We, of course, encourage and emphasize the need to have an independent oversight body, typically through an information commission or a commissioner in charge of local monitoring of the implementation of access to information guarantees. Another key event that UNESCO has been in charge of for 3 decades now is the celebration of the United Nations International Day for Universal Access to Information. This day, every year, is celebrated on September 28th, so it's forthcoming. And this year, this event will be hosted by the UK and organized at the University of Oxford. On September 28th, the global celebration of the International Day for Universal Access to Information. This year will focus on that issue in the context of digital spaces. We will be pleased to welcome at this event Mr. Joe Powell, who is the Deputy CEO of the Open Government Partnership. Let me mention maybe one last development. We know that the digital space, the digital age, offers new opportunities to democratize access to information to all. But we know also the risks that come with that, or the challenges, one of which how to combat mis and disinformation, how to combat hate speech online, how to combat discrimination, cyberbullying, all the harmful content that we see increasing exponentially on digital platforms. For this reason, UNESCO has taken a year ago a bold initiative to try, through an inclusive multi-stakeholder process, to draft regulatory guidelines for digital platforms to combat disinformation and hate speech online while safeguarding free speech online and access to information. And that's the complexity of the matter. It's not regulation in the sense of censorship. We need to regulate to try to combat the harmful content online while safeguarding free speech online. So I said we are doing this through a multi-stakeholder process involving the 194 member states of UNESCO, but also civil society organizations, the media sector, but academia, and the technology companies that operate these digital platforms. Because without them, these guidelines will not get implemented. And we don't want just to have a declaration or a recommendation. We want to have impact on the ground. Next month, UNESCO will release its guidelines for regulating digital platforms to ensure that information is a common public good and that information does not become a public hazard nor a public harm. Let me conclude by saying that we stand ready to work with all parties, being a multilateral organization, being neutral in its approach to these topics, but it's very important to promote media freedom, access to information, open and transparent governance, because these are the cornerstones of open and democratic society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's taken a bit of time, but we've got the point across. I want to invite to our panelists who are going to come and help us take this conversation forward. We will try to be very short with our answers just so that we might be able to get a few questions in. But if you don't, at least you'll be able to reach out to any one of us after this. I want to call to the stage Alison Peters, the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor at the US State Department. Please come up. And then I also want to ask Sarah Wasonga, my colleague from Kenya, who is the Program Officer, Transparency and Access to Information, Article 19, Eastern Africa. Welcome. And of course, I want to call our minister. I call him our minister because we're in Estonia, obviously. He's not our minister, but he's our minister. And then, of course, my colleague from the other side of the world, Ricardo. Thank you very much. Please take this one. I'll be at the end. Anyhow, just to start us off, I wanted us to start with Alison. I know Minister mentioned why media freedom is important, but I'm really interested, and I know a lot of us are interested in finding out about the Media Freedom Coalition. Why did governments come together to set it up, and what are some of the gains from it?
Well, thank you all so much for being here with us today on such a critically important topic. To our friends in the government of Estonia, thank you so much for hosting us this week. And to the Media Freedom Coalition and UNESCO, we are really grateful and thankful to be having this discussion as part of this week's OGP Summit. For us in the United States, we see media freedom as really a bedrock of democracy and open government and open governance. We see day in and day out, journalists are crucial to holding governments to account, to informing our citizens, to sparking public debate, and to combating corruption. And yet we continue to see journalists be under threat. We heard from the minister in the context of the illegal invasion of Ukraine, the constant threats to journalists' lives that we are seeing day in, day out. But that is not the only context in which we're seeing these threats. I think by one stat alone, we've seen 67 journalists killed in 2022 alone. In addition to physical harm, we see threats from internet shutdowns, from censorship, from commercial spyware, from gender-based online harassment and abuse. So all to say, the threats are real to journalists. And that is why the Media Freedom Coalition, which we're proud members of, is so critical, because not only are we raising awareness about the threats that we are seeing to media freedom globally, but we're responding using all the tools in our collective toolbox. The United States is just one country, but when we combine forces with the over 50 governments that are part of the Media Freedom Coalition, we are a powerful force. So we can raise awareness on the threats. We use our tools of diplomacy to intervene in specific cases, and we can talk a little bit if we have time on the successes that we've had. And we can also provide technical assistance to journalists who are under threat, whether that be legal assistance, whether that be training around digital security issues. That is really the value add of something like the Media Freedom Coalition. It's not just one government or two governments, but it is a combined force in a coalition really speaking up and calling attention to the constant threats that we are seeing to media freedom globally. And again, that's really a bedrock of all of our democracies to make sure we keep in place.
Thank you very much. I mean, one of the issues that has been coming through in the previous conversation I was at, and I think the whole essence of this open government is the whole idea of providing citizens with access to information. Maybe, Sarah, you can tell us why is it important for citizens to access information? Because we might come from different countries where access to information is not the default, is really the exception. But when we look at our different constitutions, access to information is not universal. Access to information is not really part of that mix. Maybe you can explain a bit why it is important for all of us to access information. And then, of course, I'll ask Ricardo after you, if you can go after she does that, why it's important for journalists especially to have access to information.
Okay, thank you, Catherine, and also thank you to the government of Estonia and the OGP Summit for hosting us. And universal access to information, it's not a matter of if, what, and why. I think globally, we know the right to information can be a matter of life and death. One of the reasons we've seen an overarching theme here, even from my fellow speakers and what we've been talking about in the OGP ecosystem, is that democracy is a very fragile ecosystem. And part of this fabric, or the fabric of democracy, is citizens' ability to be able to hold their governments into account. And at the core of this is the right to information, or universal access to information. It is impossible for citizens to know what their governments are doing if they do not have that right to access information. And we've seen this in the global shift. I think right now about 92% of citizens across the world live in a country that either has an access to information law or an access to information policy. Although there is a bit of disparity when you go to the global south in Africa, where it's about only 25 countries that have access to information laws. But at the core of it, let me say that sometimes when it comes to access to information, it's not just about holding governments into account. Sometimes access to information and universal access to information could be the difference between life and death. We've seen and we've constantly had the need for credible and concise and clear information, the ability for citizens to be able to receive this. And we've seen this during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen what misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation could cause. And so that is one of those reasons why we say, access to information is not a matter of, let us just enact this law, but it's a fundamental principle that allows the realization of other human rights.
Great. I mean, Ricardo, we've been in the space where access to information is not a given, like we say, in parts of the global south and in Africa especially. I know you won't talk about Africa, but maybe you can tell us from your perspective as a journalist, why is it important, especially for journalists, to have access to information and to get access to information that government is holding about its citizens?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, OGP and Government of Estonia. When I was first invited to this panel, I was reminded of this internet meme where there's two images. One is, a question says what to do with your savings? And the other image is a little kid being like, wait, you guys have savings? And I was reminded of this because I'm like, what, you guys have media freedom? You guys have open government, dialogue, accountability? That is something that in El Salvador we had. 12 years ago, we approved the 5th best access to information law in the world, and we used it as journalists. We suddenly learned how much our public officers were making, and just like Ryanair, we discovered that they also had hidden fees. We discovered who were the people behind, the shadows, the people that they usually keep in their payroll, but they're not telling us. We used access to information law to throw a former president behind bars. Actually, the person responsible for doing that is sitting in the first row. She asked information, and we discovered that he was corrupt. But we also discovered things regarding health plans, education plans, where our budgets are lacking, and we suddenly discovered that using access to information tools, especially as journalists, but civil society wide, we could break the monologue. We could break the monologue that some governments, particularly more authoritarian ones, are trying to impose to societies.
Okay.
Because they might be telling you, like, there's progress here. They might be telling you, like, we're advancing in education or healthcare or any sort of social policy.
Yeah.
But then if you start asking questions, using the law, trying to find that information that is hidden, and trying to like contrast with politicians, being like, actually, you say you have improved healthcare, but I see that you have decreased the budget. And then, not only you get the weird satisfaction of seeing politicians blush, but you also have them cornered. And then you also have them actually address people and be like, you know what? I was wrong, you're right. Due to this information that you have presented, not only to me, but to the entire society, I will now implement something better. Now that is, of course, in some cases, utopia. And in my country, now we have almost lost it all. We don't have media freedom. We have persecution. We have 31 journalists, including myself, being spied with Pegasus. We have a president that aspires to be the new, youngest, hippest, coolest dictator in the Americas. But we know what we lost, and I think we are ready to fight back because access to information might not be the sexiest topic among civil society, but being completely blindsided and blinded is even worse.
That's great. I had you when you mentioned governments. I want to turn to Minister here. Maybe ask you a question, not necessarily based on Estonia only, but what can you advise, or how can open government reform support and enable media freedom and access to information, especially for citizens? I know you mentioned that in the course of your opening statements, but what are some of the things that you would hope to see happen everywhere, because based on your own experiences in the open government sector in this country?
Yes, thank you. I'm representing now all governments in the world because I'm the minister here. But me as a human being, or me as an Estonian citizen here, but my natural understanding is that people are good. Really, they are good. And also my background before I started to study law was theology, about different religions. And if we think about that religion is one of the first things that people actually agreed about the different rules. The freedom there is also somehow mentioned as a basic value. What I think is as well that if people have access to information and solid information, and they can actually have the reaction about that. I'm not talking about scientific analysis, just as a human being reaction. And it infects the governments and leaderships. Where we see the autocracy or where we see not democratical governments, then that is normally as well no access for the free information, no opportunity liberties. And the other way around, that you mentioned very, very, very precisely there, that actually people understand that there is no freedom, then they are losing that.
Yeah.
And these kind of situations are creating conflicts. And but I think that people don't want to have conflicts. And that's the reason why this open government initiative means as well that to give the right for people to infect the governments and also the leaderships for the good ways. Unfortunately, we don't have this ideal world existing now. And also, I'm working like every day globally as well as a foreign minister to explain different nations that what is happening in Ukraine is not actually the Ukraine war or the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but this is a violation of human rights and war crimes and genocide and aggression crimes. But if I'm talking about and using these kind of words, so everybody's bored already. But if I'm talking about, as I said as well, an example that, do you know that that more than 20,000 children have been deported, kidnapped. Some of them they are for sale. Some of them they are living in Siberia's camps. And then we have globally mothers and fathers who understand this language. But there are many, many nations and countries we cannot talk about this. If we want to get the change globally, in United Nations, we are having the UNGA meeting next week or the week after in New York. This kind of information is actually changing the attitude for leadership more than the theoretical declarations about war or the international public law and whatever. So that's why I believe in open governments and media freedom having actually impact for big decisions. So we constantly keeping talk about the real bad things, and I believe that human beings are actually good. They don't want to have this kind of emotions personally as well.
Yeah.
So.
Media plays it's a major intermediary when it comes to governments and sharing of information. I don't know. I know lack of information is a big challenge. We've already had that from Ricardo. But what can each one of you individually tell me is the biggest threat to media right now? What can you say off the top of your head? What is it? Sarah, start with you, then I'll go to the minister, then Alison, and then end up with Ricardo. Don't give me a whole shopping list because we know we have a lot. But what is the most critical problem for media right now from your point of view?
I think in my case it would be the issue of impunity on attacks against journalists. I think Dr. Tafik has actually said it earlier. We have seen a lot of violations, threats and attacks against journalists in all their diversity. We've seen an increase in the number of human rights violations and violations against women journalists particular. Yeah. And I think the statistics are that only 1 in 10 of these attacks are are successfully prosecuted. Yeah. And it is not helpful that a number of these perpetrators tend to be state agencies. It's usually the police, it's usually people who work within government, and quite often then they see these attacks as justified. And so for me, if you ask me, I would say addressing the issue of impunity against journalists in all their diversity is my biggest threat at the moment.
Minister, what is the biggest threat from where you're seated as a person? She's just mentioned people within government. We're not saying it's you, but you're the politician, and Alison is not really the politician, she's the policy maker on the table. But where do you see the challenge, the biggest critical threat to media globally? Not necessarily in
thinking about globally. So the technical access to internet. Yes, the technical access for everybody. Then this is like the, of course, journalists and security of them and threats against them, and this is utmost important. But if we talk about the change, then if everybody, wherever they live, would have the free access to internet and technical tools, they can get an information and make the personal decisions. I believe that communication nowadays, globally, is personal. So, and we don't have this access.
How is access to, you're talking about the internet being a threat to journalists?
Not to journalists, but I'm talking the other way around.
Oh.
That not the journalists, but the free media.
Free media needs.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Right.
But we must have it. Then, be honest, you can cover globally the solid information, not even being physically in one or the other territory.
Okay.
The access, and this is giving a tool for journalists actually to make the job globally. So
Great.
that is my
It's an interesting perception that access can also be a threat as well as a benefit. Alison, what do you see as the biggest, most critical threat we have faced as journalists?
Well, thanks so much for the question. And, I would certainly agree that impunity for attacks on journalists from all sides is certainly a tremendous issue of concern. One additional that I will raise, which is a critical concern for the Biden administration in the United States, is the threat of commercial spyware. This is something that you spoke about quite briefly, but we see a growing trend of commercially available malicious cyber tools that are increasingly available globally. In some cases, require no click of a link to put this malicious software onto people's devices, which means the ability for journalists to operate safely and securely to protect their sources, to protect their information, to protect their physical safety is at risk. It means that we have a situation in which all of the reporting that journalists do globally could be accessible to governments and non-governments around the globe. It is something that we are actively working to combat in terms of the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. I won't go into detail because we don't have time, but we are taking steps inside our own government to crack down on this proliferation and misuse, because we feel it's important to send a strong signal of how unacceptable this is. And certainly when we talk about threats to journalists, this is something that is of increasing concern to us.
Just tell us what it is, and then I'll come back to you, Alison, because you mentioned something which I am curious about. But what is it? What's the one thing you think is the most critical threat to us as journalists?
Well, I would agree with you all, and to add something else, I would say hate speech, because hate speech and framing journalists as the enemy of the people, as Donald Trump did, as Vladimir Putin does, as Nayib Bukele does in El Salvador, as Jair Bolsonaro did in Brazil, it not only walks hand by hand with current violence, but it waters the ground for future violence. It makes the people believe that we are enemies, that we are getting on the way of progress when we're actually asking questions about it. And it will justify, at some point, any act of violence, any sort of violence against journalists, because people will believe what some politicians say from their bully pulpits.
Okay. Alison,
May I just to correct the common understanding that what I wanted to say is that I was mentioning the access to internet globally is not a threat to journalists, but free media.
Free
media.
Okay.
Because miscommunication from my side.
Okay.
So.
Gotcha. Alison, coming back to you, we've talked about all these threats. Maybe you can expound more on how the Media Freedom Coalition is working to complement efforts by different governments. There are some governments that are really committed to media freedom and are doing as much as they can, but how can the MFC help these governments make it possible for journalism and open media to continue prospering in their regions or their countries?
Yeah, well, I think what makes the Media Freedom Coalition unique in some ways is it's a very large group. I mean, we're talking over 50 governments with quite a lot of regional diversity. I think there is power that comes from conversations that can happen not just publicly, such as this, but conversations that we can also have behind closed doors with each other, raising issues around media freedom, raising issues around impunity and the digital threats that we're talking about. So there is a really sort of powerful impact that having such a coalition where we can gather and talk about these issues can have in terms of raising awareness. And also us doing collective advocacy, both to hold each other to account, but also to raise the profile of this issue set in various different multilateral fora, whether that be in the UN, such as in UNESCO, or in other bodies globally. But I will say something that also makes the coalition unique is our ability to combine forces when it comes to providing technical assistance, and I spoke a little bit about this, but for example, even in our own government, at our USAID, our development agency, we have a program called Reporters Shield, which is working to provide legal support to journalists. But we're not the only government that has such a program. And so when we can combine forces to invest in the need to protect journalists or provide them with the technical assistance and support that they need, then that's even more powerful. We've also had cases where the coalition has intervened to provide emergency visas to journalists that need to leave their countries because of the threats that they're facing, to provide other sorts of emergency assistance in those cases as well. We would not know about those needs if we didn't have an information sharing mechanism in the Media Freedom Coalition to do that. So I know sometimes coalitions seem like we just gather and have a conversation with each other on these issues and then walk away, but truly we have seen, and there's some public reporting that the coalition has done that assesses impact, but we've seen in specific cases where having this collective power has been really important to intervening when we have cases of threats to journalists and other media workers.
I know we're running out of time, but I want to ask each and every one of you to tell me what are the priorities and future goals for government and even the Freedom Coalition. Sorry, guys. I keep on talking about collaborations because I've had this word throughout the session, and I think it's a very important word. In terms of advancing media freedom, what is the one thing that you think we could do from your different spaces, either as civil society, as government, as policymakers, as journalists? What is the one thing that we can each be able to do to advance this? Sarah, you can start. I'll end up with, and then Ricardo, and then I'll end up with the minister.
I think I'll first reference Article 19's Global Expression Report, which shows that over the past decade, we've seen press freedom and freedom of expression being on a steady decline. I think the current situation where we are in, according to the report, it shows that more than 6 billion people across the world are living with less freedom of expression than they did in the year 2000. And we are in the second decade of OGP. And so for me, I think the issue of freedom of expression, media freedom, and the protection of rights of journalists and information as a whole is a collective issue. We are here because the Open Government Partnership literally has the term partnership in its title and its name. And we talk a lot about co-creation, coalition, collaboration, but the reality is collectively, when we go back to our countries, governments go to do their thing, civil society does its own thing, private sector does its own thing. Then we will meet in Estonia the next time. We'll talk about if you're having visa issues, we'll come to the beautiful city of Tallinn, and this drops there. So for me, I would say collective action, a collective call for all of us to be able to foster the issue of transparency, accountability, and the protection of media freedom, particularly in implementing OGP. I'm hoping that from the conversations we've had in these sessions, we will see a lot of commitments that are specific to the protection of media freedom, and we will see a lot of inclusion, particularly within the media ecosystem in the OGP framework.
Okay. What are you going to do from the journalist point of view? What would you tell journalists who are participating or following this conversation? What is the key priority that we as journalists should be able to do to make sure that we continue being able to create an environment that allows us to do our work? Yeah, what is our contribution?
In the case of journalists, I think we have to keep asking questions, no matter how uncomfortable they are, no matter how unfriendly the governments are. But there is another priority on the other side, and it's we have two kinds of threats as I see it. We have democratic backsliding in many countries, and we have a difficult economic situation for the media industry. So if I had the chance to ask for two things that are like a priority, one would be calling authoritarians by their name. Stop giving authoritarian leaders second, third, or fourth chances when they have shown us who they are. And I would also ask, for ways to make journalism sustainable, because investigative journalism is not highly profitable. It is not the sexiest thing to invest in, but it is really important to know who they really are. So to me, those are the two things to address: democratic backsliding and calling authoritarians by their name, without coddling them, without patting them in the back, hoping they will change one day and fall out of love with power, and addressing the economic crisis in the media industry.
Alison, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke a little bit about the intervention in specific cases, but I think taking sort of a macro level view as a democracy and as fellow governments, I think there's two really critical things that we should be continuing to push on. I think first and foremost, pushing for systemic changes in governments around the globe, whether that be on rule of law, whether that be pushing for access to information statutes, whether that be pushing on pieces of legislation dealing with the protections of journalists. That's where we as democracies, as governments, can use the tools of our diplomacy, use our development tools as well to really push for changes. And again, that may take many different forms. That may be public conversations, that may be private conversations, that may be using our tools of accountability, our sanctions tools, our visa tools to really push for change. But I think that's where we can really make an impact. And second, I will echo our president who talks about the need to strive for a more perfect union, but none of our governments are perfect, and we fully recognize that. And so continuing to push ourselves to make changes, both both at home in the United States, certainly, but for all of our governments as fellow democracies in the Media Freedom Coalition, where we do hear from journalists, where we hear from civil society about necessary changes to continue to promote media freedom. We should be taking those ideas into perspective, and we should be making changes. That is how we can continue to show that we are a force for good and change when it comes to media freedom, and that we are protecting against that backsliding.
Thank you very much, Alison. Minister, and this will be our last word, so better be short, sweet, and also give our audience something to take away, because we may not have enough time to take questions.
Yeah.
Just two things that you think we need to prioritize if you want to make it possible, and especially with the media freedom collaboration. I call it collaboration deliberately. Please forgive me for this. It's a coalition, I know, but I keep on calling it collaboration because in my head that is essentially what it is. But Minister, I'm really interested in maybe you closing us out by telling us what are the two key priorities you see if you're going to pursue this agenda, as it were, this to make it possible for journalists for journalism across the world, not only in Europe or wherever, across the world, become what it should be and be sustainable.
Yes, it's of course really hard to say two things, but first, one thing is very practical, what we already do and what we want to do as an Estonian government globally to encourage other governments as well. Actually, what governments can do for journalists and free media is to create conditions. And what we have decided this year is actually we are issuing 35 residency permits per year for journalists at risk globally, and it is under the foreign ministry. So this is something we can do practically, and if we can encourage as well other governments globally to work like this, so we can maybe offer for journalists at risk these kind of conditions, they can actually continue the very important work, not even located in the state where they are at risk, but they can continue. This is practical thing what we do already. And of course, the other thing is that we have Russia and Belarus, the other side of our eastern borders. So we constantly give the humanitarian visas for the journalists to bring them out and let them and give them conditions to work here in all regions to continue a very important work. And the second thing is like the big scale thing is actually we're working hard using free media, using and having this courage to speak out, to fight against and with the gray shadows of different nations and states from the history globally, that actually the leadership, one case is Putin, can be put under the International Special Tribunal because of the aggression of crimes of aggression. And this is actually, it is impossible to make agreements and deals, some are official meetings. We have to use free media and also express all the people globally that actually these kind of crimes are not tolerated. So, and these two things together, I think that one is very practical thing and the other is practical as well, but this is a very big topic and we are not there yet. So, thank you.
Great. I mean, the solutions are as diverse as the panel which is here today, but I guess if we were to open it up to to you guys, would come up with even more practical as well as, what would I call it, policy solutions. I think I would just want to say one last thing, maybe ask from one of you, or not one of you, each of you, key takeaway from this conversation. What did you want them to take away from this discussion? And then we can close out. We may not have time for questions. We only have 5 minutes, so I want 1 minute less than a minute from each of you. What is your key takeaway from this discussion? And please, I apologize, we were not able to take any questions, but we can meet afterwards. Like we say in Kenya, meet behind the tent. But we can take the questions after this. Reach out to any one of us. Thank you. So Sarah, one takeaway, one thing, less than a minute.
There's literally no democracy without a free and independent media. And if we want to say our democracies are legitimate to governments, to citizens, to everyone, then free and independent media is part and parcel of that. And because this is a concerning issue, I call all of you to go and have a look at our Global Expression report. And then after having that look, have conversation with your stakeholders and address the concerns that we are seeing.
Ricardo, last takeaway.
I guess if you're going to take the example of El Salvador, it is sadly a bad example and something not to follow. But the example is that in democracy, there are no happy endings. This is not a fairy tale in which we see democracy grow and then we leave it on its own. Access to information, media freedom, accountability, those things do not grow on their own. So it's like a bicycle. You need to keep pedaling in order to keep advancing forward. If not, you're going to end up where we are. You know, we now live with the nostalgia of having had the fifth best access to information law. Well, now all the gates are closed in our country. So there's no happy endings.
Alison?
I think the biggest takeaway I hope you get from this conversation, just seeing the diversity of this panel up here, is that none of us have all the solutions here when it comes to media freedom. I mean, you spoke about media viability, we spoke about digital threats, we spoke about access to information, but I think combined, bringing all of our perspectives into the fold, we do have some viable solutions to this problem. Hope is not completely lost, but that's where having conversations like this, getting the ideas, and really having journalists at the table, holding us as governments to account to make those changes is critically important. So I hope we can continue these conversations over the next 2 days.
Thank you. Minister, take away one thing.
Yes, one thing is that we must constantly understand that the countries when we have democracy and the media freedom, this is not granted. We have to fight for that as well. And also we have to fight for these people's media freedom they don't have now. It is one thing, and the other thing is actually there is a global fight about people's minds.
Yeah.
So, and they make decisions finally. So we have to understand that the people must have a right to make their own decisions, and it means based on the free information and not disinformation. So, and for that we have to work every day hardly. It is not granted.
Yeah.
So, and we understand that when it is, gone, and it's too late.
Thank you. Thank you very much. From this, I wish we had more time, because there are quite a few things I'm really interested in. I know we're interested in discussing even in deeper details, including the good work that the MFC is doing. Especially, I love the suggestion of offering support to journalists who are, the visa system. I think that is fantastic. And I know it takes governments to make those kind of decisions, but it doesn't hurt me, journalists, Ricardo journalists, saying, come over, I'll help you figure out how to tell this story. But at the root of all this is one thing which I think Dr. Tawfik alluded to, and the minister, as well as Alison herself, has alluded to. Human beings are essentially good. We are essentially good. Yeah. And if you give us information, it doesn't mean we're going to cause chaos or do crazy stuff. We're going to use that information for good for ourselves. For me as a journalist, denying me information, and Ricardo has spoken about it, means you're not talking to the innate goodness of our citizens. It means we're devaluing our citizens. So if we are open to sharing information with our citizens, most likely than not, they will do the expected good thing. It's only one or two of us who may not be that. So the idea of being open, the idea of supporting media, and media is a reflection of its society. So if you have an open government, obviously the media is going to be open. And some of the challenges we're facing as media, viability, sustainability, how do we make money, might find a solution if governments are open. So for me and the rest of the panelists here, I want to please help me give them a big thank you by clapping. I can only do this because I have one hand. I know that's the idea. But thank you very much for coming, and please reach out to any one of us if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Dear guests, thank you for attending this session. The program in this hall will continue in 30 minutes. Please get some fresh air in the meantime.